The courtroom froze as the doors swung open. Everyone expected a defeated housewife begging for scraps. Instead, they saw a woman wearing a tailored suit worth more than her ex-husband's Ferrari. Richard laughed when he served the divorce papers, claiming she was penniless without him. He even demanded she pay him for wasting his prime years. But he didn't check the one sealed file from the Swiss consulate. Today, Victoria wasn't fighting for half. She was about to reveal she owned the bank that held his mortgage. Watch what happens when a bully realizes he's just an ant. The air in the Manhattan Supreme Court civil term smelled of floor wax and desperate negotiations. Outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 312, the hallway was a blur of frantic whispers and rustling case files. But inside the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. Victoria sat alone at the defendant's table. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her simple, off-the-rack navy skirt. She looked down at the scratched mahogany table, refusing to make eye contact with the man sitting 10 feet away. Richard, her husband of 6 years, the man who had once promised to build a world with her, now looking at her with the same disdain he usually reserved for waiters who messed up his drink order at the Soho House. He was leaning back in his chair, whispering something to his attorney, a shark-faced man named Bradford Sterling. Richard let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mr. Sterling?" Judge Harrison said, his voice weary. He adjusted his glasses, looking over the rim at the plaintiff's table. "You may proceed with your opening statement regarding the division of assets." Bradford Sterling stood up, smoothing the lapels of his $3,000 Brioni suit. He didn't walk. He prowled. He moved toward the center of the room, turning his back to Victoria, as if she were insignificant, addressing the gallery where Richard's new fiancée Jessica sat smirking in a bright, red dress that was far too bold for court. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "we are here today because my client, Mr. Richard Halloway, a senior vice president at Goldman Sachs, has been the victim of financial parasitism for nearly a decade." Victoria flinched. "Parasitism. Ms. Victoria Halloway." Sterling continued, finally turning to point a manicured finger at her. "Brought nothing into this marriage. She has contributed zero to the marital assets. While Mr. Halloway worked 80-hour weeks closing mergers that shaped the New York skyline, what was his wife doing? She was dabbing in a hobby business, a small antique repair shop in Brooklyn that has never not once turned a profit." Richard snickered. "It's a glorified storage unit," he whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "Exactly," Sterling said, catching the comment and running with it. "A drain on resources. My client paid the rent for her shop. He paid for her supplies. He paid for the very clothes on her back. And now, after he has decided to end this charade of a marriage, she has the audacity to ask for spousal support." Sterling paused for dramatic effect, shaking his head. "No, Your Honor. We are filing a counter-motion. We are asking that Ms. Halloway reimburse the marital estate for the funds she squandered on her failed business ventures over the last 6 years. We estimate the total to be roughly $250,000. We want her to leave this marriage exactly as she entered it, with nothing." The judge frowned, scribbling notes. "Ms. Halloway, you are representing yourself today." Victoria slowly stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like lead. She hadn't been able to afford a retainer for a high-end divorce attorney. Richard had frozen their joint accounts the morning he filed, leaving her with $12 in her debit account and a maxed-out credit card. She had tried to find legal aid, but Richard made too much money for her to qualify. Yet she had access to none of it. "Yes, Your Honor," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you have a response to Mr. Sterling's opening?" I worked, Your Honor," she said, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. I managed our home. I hosted his business dinners. I repaired the furniture he broke when he came home drunk. The antique shop didn't turn a profit because Richard forced me to use the business account to pay for his car lease payments, to hide them from his firm's compliance officers. Objection, Sterling barked, slamming his hand on the table. Hearsay slander. There is no record of that. Sustained, the judge sighed. Ms. Holloway, stick to the facts that can be proven. Do you have financial records? I couldn't access them. He changed the passwords, Victoria admitted, feeling the familiar sting of tears she refused to shed. Richard leaned forward, a cruel grin playing on his lips. He looked at her like she was a bug he had already crushed. He checked his Rolex, a submariner she had saved for 2 years to buy him for his promotion. He looked bored. He wanted this over so he could go to lunch at Le Bernardin with Jessica. Your Honor, Sterling said, smirking, this is a waste of the court's time. She has no counsel, no evidence, and no assets. We ask for a summary judgment. Grant the divorce, deny the alimony, and order the reimbursement. The judge looked at Victoria with pity. It was the look one gave to a wounded animal on the side of the road, sad but unwilling to stop the car. Ms. Holloway, the judge said softly. Unless you have something substantial to present, I am inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiff. You are unprepared. The courtroom was silent. Richard turned to Jessica and winked. It was over. The humiliation was complete. But then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom groaned. It wasn't a normal entrance. It was a breach. First came the sound, the rhythmic, synchronized clicking of hard-soled shoes on the marble floor. Not one person, but a legion. A young associate in a sharp grey suit pushed the doors wide open and held them. Who is interrupting my court? Judge Harrison demanded, banging his gavel. Apologies, Your Honor. A voice boomed from the hallway. It was a voice like crushed velvet, and iron smooth deep and terrifyingly authoritative. Traffic on the FDR drive was murder. We would have taken the helicopter, but there's no landing pad on Center Street. Into the light stepped a man who looked less like a lawyer and more like a king visiting his subjects. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair swept back perfectly. He wore a bespoke 3-piece suit that made Sterling's Brioni look like a costume from a discount bin. Behind him walked 4 other attorneys each, carrying thick leather briefcases stamped with gold initials. The room gasped. Even the court stenographer stopped typing. Bradford Sterling, the shark who had been terrorizing Victoria moments ago, went pale. His jaw literally dropped. He grabbed Richard's arm. What? Richard snapped, annoyed. Who is that old guy? Shut up, Richard, Sterling hissed, panic cracking his voice. That's Alistair Blackwood. So he's the managing partner at Blackwood, Hale and Rothschild. Sterling whispered, sweating. He doesn't do divorces. He defends sovereign nations. He represents the British Crown. He charges $5,000 an hour just to read an email. Alistair Blackwood walked past the stunned gallery, past the trembling Sterling, and stopped right in front of the defendant's table. He didn't look at the judge yet. He looked at Victoria. The entire room watched as this titan of industry actually bowed to the woman in the cheap navy skirt. Madam, Blackwood said softly, offering her a leather portfolio. My deepest apologies for the delay. The board of directors in Zurich insisted I deliver this personally. Victoria looked at him confused. She had never seen this man in her life. I don't understand. Who are you? Blackwood smiled, a genuine warm smile. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, Alistair Blackwood, appearing on behalf of the defendant, Mrs. Victoria Holloway. And if it pleases the court, I would like to file a motion to dismiss the plaintiff's demand for reimbursement." "On what grounds?" the judge asked, stunned. "On the grounds," Blackwood said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "that seeking $200,000 from a woman whose personal trust fund generates that amount in interest every 4 hours is, well, frankly, it's beneath the dignity of this court." Richard stood up, his face red. "What the hell is he talking about?" "She's broke. I paid for her coffee this morning." Blackwood turned to Richard. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by cold steel. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway," Blackwood said. "You are playing checkers. We are playing global finance." To understand the explosion that was about to occur in courtroom 3121, had to understand the silence that Victoria had lived in for the last 20 years. Victoria hadn't lied to Richard about her background exactly. She had simply omitted the parts she didn't understand herself. She knew she was an orphan. Her parents had died in a skiing accident in the French Alps when she was 3. She had been raised by her grandmother, a stern, quiet woman named Helena, who lived in a small, dusty cottage in rural Connecticut. Helena was peculiar. She insisted Victoria learn French, German, and Mandarin before she was 10. She forced her to memorize the stock tickers of European shipping companies instead of nursery rhymes, but they lived simply. They drove a 20-year-old Volvo. They clipped coupons. Victoria wore hand-me-down clothes. When Victoria met Richard in college, she was working 2 jobs, one at the library and one as a barista. Richard was loud, confident, and threw money around like confetti. He was everything her quiet, austere life wasn't. He bought her gifts. He took her to dinners where the menus didn't have prices. She thought he was her savior. She didn't see the cracks until the ring was on her finger. The suggestions on how she should dress. The jokes about her peasant upbringing in front of his Wall Street friends. The way he slowly isolated her from the few friends she had. "You're lucky I found you," he would say, when he was drunk, gripping her arm a little too tight. "You'd be waiting tables in a diner if it weren't for me." And she believed him. 6 months ago, her grandmother Helena passed away. Richard didn't even come to the funeral. "I have a meeting with the partners," he had said, not looking up from his phone. "She was just an old lady, Victoria. Get over it." Victoria had gone alone. She buried Helena in a small plot in Connecticut. There was no reading of the will, no lawyer present, just a letter Helena had left on her nightstand. "My dearest Victoria, if you are reading this, I am gone. You have lived a humble life as I intended. Wealth is a poison if you drink it before you are ready. I wanted you to know the value of $1 before you knew the burden of $1 billion. You are kind, you are patient, you are strong, but you are married to a man who does not see you. I have watched him. I do not approve. There is a safety deposit box at the sovereign branch of UBS in Zurich. The key is taped to the back of the photo of your grandfather in the hallway. Do not go there until you are ready to change everything." Victoria had ignored the letter. She was grieving. She was trying to save her marriage. She was trying to make her antique shop work, despite Richard constantly belittling it. Then came the discovery. 2 weeks ago, she had come home early from the shop to surprise Richard for their anniversary. She found Jessica's heels in the hallway. She heard them in the bedroom. She heard Richard mocking her. "God, no, I'm not leaving her yet." Richard's voice had drifted through the door. Her grandmother just died. I think the old hag might have left her the house in Connecticut. The land might be worth a couple $100,000. Once I get her to sign that over to me for investment purposes, then I'll dump her. Victoria had left the house without making a sound. She drove straight to Connecticut. She broke the frame of her grandfather's photo. The key was there. heavy gold with a complex, laser-etched code. She didn't go to Zurich. She called the number on the back of the key. She expected a bank teller. Instead, the phone was answered on the first ring. "Access code verified," a voice said. "Madam President, we have been waiting for your call. Protocol Ascension is now active. Mr. Blackwood is already en route to New York." "Who is this?" Victoria had whispered, sitting on the floor of her empty childhood bedroom. "This is the office of the Secretariat for the Sterling Kensington Consortium. Your grandmother, Helena von Kensington, was the majority shareholder. You are the sole heir." Victoria had dropped the phone. The Sterling Kensington Consortium. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. It was a conglomerate that owned luxury hotels, shipping lines, pharmaceutical patents, and... She looked at the paperwork Richard had left on the kitchen counter months ago. His firm, Goldman Sachs, had been trying to land a deal with a subsidiary of Sterling Kensington for 3 years. Richard had complained about it constantly. "The owners are ghosts," he'd rant. "No one knows who runs the damn thing, Grandma." Victoria had sat there for hours as the realization washed over her. The poverty was a lesson. The frugality was a test. And Richard was about to find out that he hadn't married a peasant. He had married the Queen, and he had treated her like a servant. Back in the courtroom, Alistair Blackwood placed a heavy stack of documents on the defense table. The sound thudded through the room, snapping Victoria back to the present. "Mr. Sterling Blackwood said, turning to the opposing counsel with a predatory smile, "You mentioned your client, Mr. Holloway, as a senior vice president at Goldman Sachs. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sterling stammered, trying to regain his composure. "And a highly respected one." "Excellent," Blackwood said. "Then he will be familiar with the concept of a conflict of interest. You see, I have here a deed of ownership." Blackwood lifted a single sheet of paper. "This document certifies that the commercial real estate located at 200 West Street, the headquarters of Goldman Sachs, is owned by a holding company called Helena Properties." Richard rolled his eyes. "So what, my company rents the building?" "Big deal." "Indeed," Blackwood purred. "And Helena Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Von Kensington Trust." He turned to Victoria and bowed his head slightly, "which is solely owned by Mrs. Victoria Holloway." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Richard's face went from red to a sickly shade of grey. That's impossible," Richard whispered. "Her grandmother was a broke old lady in Connecticut." "Her grandmother," Blackwood corrected, "was Helena von Kensington, the Iron Duchess of European Steel. And she didn't like you, Mr. Holloway. She didn't like you at all." Blackwood turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is currently employed in a building owned by my client. He drives a car leased from a finance arm owned by my client. The very suit he is wearing was likely produced by a textile firm owned by my client. Ms. Holloway is not asking for alimony. She is asking for an immediate annulment on the grounds of fraud, and she is filing a civil suit for emotional damages." Blackwood paused, looking at his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Richard's annual bonus. "And just for housekeeping," Blackwood added casually, "Ms. Holloway has instructed the board of Helena Properties to review the lease agreement for 200 West Street. I believe there is a clause regarding moral turpitude of the tenants. It would be a shame if Goldman Sachs lost their headquarters because one of their VPs couldn't keep his vows." Richard slumped into his chair. Jessica slowly pulled her hand away from his arm, inching away from him on the bench. Victoria looked up. For the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw him for what he was: small, greedy, finite. "I have one condition," Victoria said, her voice clear and steady. Everyone looked at her. "I want the apology," she said. "On the record." The silence in courtroom 312 was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air right out of Richard Halloway's lungs. He stared at Victoria, his eyes darting between her impassive face and the mountain of documents Alistair Blackwood had placed on the table. An apology. Richard choked out, his voice cracking. He looked at his lawyer, Bradford Sterling, for help. "Bradford, do something. This is insanity. She's bluffing. She fixes broken lamps for a living." But Bradford Sterling was no longer looking at Richard. He was hurriedly packing his briefcase. The shark had smelled blood in the water, and he realized it was his own. "Mr. Halloway," Sterling hissed, not bothering to whisper anymore, "I advise you to do exactly what Mr. Blackwood suggests. I am looking at the seal on these documents. That is the Kensington crest. If you want to leave this room with your skin intact, you will apologize. But I am withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately," Sterling announced, standing up. "What?" Richard shrieked, jumping to his feet. "You can't do that. I paid you a $50,000 retainer, and I will be refunding the unused portion," Sterling said, clutching his briefcase to his chest like a life preserver. He looked at Blackwood with a terrified nod. "Mr. Blackwood, it is an honor to be in your presence. I had no idea of the conflict. I trust you understand I was acting on limited information provided by a deceitful client." Blackwood didn't even look at Sterling. He just waved a hand dismissively, like shooing a fly. Sterling practically ran out of the courtroom, the double doors swinging wildly behind him. Richard stood alone. His fiancée Jessica was frozen in the front row. Her face, usually a mask of perfectly applied contour and arrogance, was now a portrait of calculation. She was doing the math. Richard minus his assets, minus his lawyer, plus a vengeful billionaire ex-wife equaled a very bad investment. "Mr. Halloway," Judge Harrison said, his tone icy, "your counsel has fled. You are facing a motion for annulment based on fraud and a countersuit that, if half of what Mr. Blackwood says is true, could bankrupt you 10 times over. The defendant has offered you a grace period in exchange for an apology. I suggest you take it." Richard gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. He looked at Victoria. For 6 years he had looked down on her. He had criticized her cooking her clothes, her quiet demeanor. He had convinced himself she was lucky to breathe the same air as him. Now she was sitting there, spine straight, eyes clear. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. "Victoria." Richard started putting on his best sales pitch voice, the voice he used to close deals. "Honey, look, things got heated. Lawyers right. They twist everything. You know I didn't mean those things about the shop. I was just stressed. The market has been volatile." He took a step toward her, a charming, boyish grin plastered on his sweating face. "We can fix this," he said, opening his arms. "You and me. We were a team. If you really have this inheritance, think of what we could do. We could be a power couple. New York wouldn't know what hit it. You need someone who understands finance to manage that kind of money, Vic. You can't trust these old lawyers. You need me." Alistair Blackwood stepped forward, his body blocking Richard's path like a granite wall. "Step back!" Blackwood rumbled. Victoria stood up slowly. She walked around the table, bypassing Blackwood, until she was 2 feet from Richard. She smelled his cologne Santal 33, the scent she used to associate with safety, now just the smell of betrayal. "You think this is about money, Richard?" she asked softly. "It's always about money. Vic." He laughed nervously. "Come on, Don't be dramatic. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. There, I said it. Now let's go get lunch and talk about this trust fund structure." Victoria stared at him. The apology was as hollow as his soul. "You missed the point," she said. "I didn't ask for an apology to make us even. I asked for it to see if you were capable of humility, just a shred of it." She shook her head. "Mr. Blackwood." "Yes, madame. Proceed with the eviction." Victoria said, her voice ringing clear in the silence. "And contact the ethics board at Goldman Sachs. Send them the transcripts of his abusive text messages to me from his work phone. I believe violating company policy on harassment using company assets is grounds for immediate termination with cause." "No!" Richard screamed, lunging forward. "You can't do that. My career is everything." Two bailiffs stepped in, instantly restraining him. "And Richard," Victoria added, turning her back on him, "I'm keeping the dog." As the bailiffs dragged a shouting Richard back to his seat, a commotion broke out in the gallery. Jessica stood up. She smoothed her red dress, grabbed her purse, and walked into the aisle. "Jessica," Richard yelled, looking over his shoulder. "Jess, call the firm. Tell them it's a misunderstanding." Jessica stopped. She looked at Richard. Then she looked at Victoria. She walked up to the railing. "Miss Halloway," Jessica said. Victoria paused. "I didn't know," Jessica said, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me you were a leech. He told me he was supporting you out of pity." "And that made it okay to sleep with a married man in my bed?" Victoria asked coldly. Jessica flinched. "No, it didn't. But for what it's worth, he's broke. He put the engagement ring on a credit card, and he's 2 months behind on the lease for his bachelor pad." Jessica pulled the diamond ring off her finger and tossed it onto the table in front of Richard. It clattered loudly. "I'm out," Jessica said. "Good luck, Richard. You're going to need it." She marched out of the courtroom, leaving Richard Halloway utterly alone. "Case adjourned." Judge Harrison banged the gavel, shaking his head. "Mr. Blackwood, please file your motions by Monday. Mr. Halloway, I suggest you find a public defender." Victoria walked toward the doors. As she pushed them open, she expected the quiet hallway. Instead, she was blinded by flashbulbs. Someone had tipped off the press. "Miss Halloway, is it true you're the heir to the Kensington fortune? Victoria, are you buying the Knicks? Miss Halloway over here." Victoria froze. She wasn't ready for this. She felt the panic rising, the old instinct to hide, to shrink, to let Richard do the talking. Then she felt a hand on her elbow. Steady. Reassuring. "Chin up, madam," Alistair Blackwood whispered in her ear. "You are a lioness. Do not lower your head for the hyenas. Walk to the car. Do not stop." Victoria took a deep breath. She remembered Helena. She remembered the years of silence. She straightened her back, put on a pair of sunglasses she didn't remember owning. Blackwood had slipped them into her hand and walked through the crowd like she was parting the Red Sea. She didn't answer a single question. She didn't smile. She just walked. At the curb, a convoy of 3 black SUVs waited. The doors opened in unison. Victoria slid into the middle one. The door thudded shut, sealing out the noise of the world. Inside it was quiet. The seats were cream leather. There was a chilled bottle of sparkling water waiting. Victoria slumped back against the seat and let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands were shaking. "Did I do it?" she whispered. "Is it over?" Blackwood sat opposite her, crossing his legs. He smiled, a genuine grandfatherly twinkle in his eye. "Over," he chuckled softly. "Oh no, my dear. That was just the prologue. The story is just beginning." The motorcade didn't head toward Brooklyn. It didn't head toward any neighborhood Victoria was familiar with. It wove through traffic escorted by 2 NYPD motorcycles that had mysteriously appeared to clear the path. "Where are we going?" Victoria asked, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. "The plaza," Blackwood said, tapping on a tablet. "Your grandmother kept the penthouse suite permanently reserved. It has been prepared for your arrival. It is more secure than your apartment. We have already sent a team to retrieve your personal effects from the Brooklyn residence. The dog Barnaby is already there waiting for you." Victoria felt a lump in her throat. "Barnaby is safe. He is currently eating a Wagyu steak prepared by the hotel chef," Blackwood noted dryly. "He is very safe." Victoria looked out the window. "I don't know how to do this, Alistair. I don't know how to be this. Yesterday I was worrying about paying the electric bill." "That is why I am here," Blackwood said. "And that is why they are here." The council," Blackwood said ominously. "Your grandmother did not run the Sterling Kensington Consortium alone. She had a circle of trusted advisors, specialists. They have been waiting 20 years for the heir to emerge. They are waiting for you at the suite." The car pulled up to the private entrance of the plaza. Doormen in white gloves rushed to open the doors. Victoria stepped out, and for the first time, she noticed the way people looked at her. It wasn't the dismissal she was used to. It was awe, or perhaps fear. They took the private elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, Victoria gasped. The penthouse was larger than her entire childhood home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park. The decor was tasteful, old-world luxury velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that looked like they belonged in the Louvre. Standing in the center of the living room were 3 people. "Madam Holloway," Blackwood announced, "may I introduce your transition team?" A tall, severe-looking woman with silver hair cut in a sharp bob stepped forward. She held a measuring tape like a weapon. "I am Genevieve," she said with a French accent. "Your wardrobe is offensive. We will burn it. I have already curated a collection for the season. We begin fittings in 20 minutes. You cannot rule the world in polyester." Next, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He wore a tactical earpiece and a suit that struggled to contain his muscles. "I am Kane," he said, his voice gravelly. "Head of security. I've audited your digital footprint. You use password 123 for your email. This ends today. I've also assigned a detail to shadow you 24/7. No one gets within 10 feet of you without my permission." Finally, a young woman, no older than Victoria, with glasses and a tablet that she was typing on furiously. "I'm Sophie," she said, not looking up. "PR and brand management. I've already scrubbed your Facebook. I've set up official accounts. I've drafted a press release regarding the divorce. We're spinning it as a shedding of dead weight to focus on philanthropic endeavors. Also, Vogue wants an exclusive." I told them to wait. Victoria stood there, overwhelmed. Hi. "We have work to do," Genevieve said, clapping her hands. "The board of directors meeting is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. "Tomorrow?" Victoria panicked. "I can't face the board tomorrow. I don't know anything about the company." Blackwood stepped in. "You don't need to know the operations yet, Victoria. You just need to show them you are the owner. There are sharks in the water. Specifically your cousin." "I have a cousin, Arthur Sterling." Blackwood sighed. "No relation to your ex-husband's incompetence lawyer. Arthur is the son of Helena's estranged brother. He is the current CEO. He believes the company is rightfully his. He has been running things since Helena got sick. He thinks you are a weak country bumpkin who will sign over voting rights in exchange for a shopping spree. He plans to propose a vote of no confidence tomorrow to strip you of your power before you even sit in the chair." Victoria felt a flash of anger. Another man who thought she was weak. Another man who wanted to take what was hers. "He thinks I'm weak," Victoria asked, her voice hardening. "He is banking on it," Blackwood said. Victoria looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. She saw the tired eyes, the slumped shoulders. Then she thought of Richard's laugh in the courtroom. She thought of the way he looked at her like she was nothing. She straightened up. "Genevieve," Victoria said. "Oui, madame." "You said we have 20 minutes." "Yes." "Make it 10, Victoria said. "I want to look like I own the building, not like I'm visiting it." The next morning, the conference room on the 50th floor of the Sterling Kensington Tower was cold. The air conditioning was set to a temperature designed to keep people awake and uncomfortable. Around the massive oval table sat 12 men and women. They were the masters of the universe. They controlled shipping lanes, pharmaceutical prices, and tech stocks. At the head of the table sat Arthur Sterling. He was handsome in a cruel way, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He checked his watch. 9:05, Arthur said, addressing the room. "She's late. Typical. I told you she's not serious. She's a housewife who got lucky." We proceed with the vote. I move that we strip the Class A shares of voting power and transfer control to the Executive Committee. "Arthur, we should wait," an older board member said nervously. "She is Helena's heir." "Helena is dead," Arthur snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "And her granddaughter is a nobody who was married to a mid-level banker. She doesn't know a balance sheet from a grocery list. Do you want this company to crumble because we let a child steer the ship I am saving us?" I second the motion, a sycophantic board member to Arthur's right said. "All in favor?" Arthur asked, raising his hand. 5 hands went up. Then 6. He needed 7 for a majority. The heavy double doors swung open. But it wasn't a servant with coffee. Kane, the security chief, walked in, first scanning the room. He stepped aside. Victoria Halloway entered. She was unrecognizable from the woman in the courtroom. She wore a bespoke white power suit that fit her like a second skin, sharp and architectural. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe bun. She wore no jewelry except for a vintage brooch, Helena's signature emerald brooch, pinned to her lapel. She didn't walk. She glided. The silence in the room was absolute. "I apologize for the delay," Victoria said, her voice cool and composed. "The elevator seemed to require a biometric update to recognize my clearance. I'll have IT look into it." She walked to the head of the table. Arthur didn't move. He sat there glaring at her. "You're in my seat, Arthur," Victoria said. Arthur chuckled, leaning back. "Victoria, nice of you to join us. We were just discussing the burden of leadership. I was explaining to the board that you might prefer a silent role. Less stress. You can go shopping travel. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals." Victoria smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was Helena's smile. "That's very thoughtful of you, Arthur," she said. She reached into her portfolio, which Sophie had handed her, and pulled out a single blue folder. "However," she continued, "I did some light reading last night, specifically the internal audit reports regarding the Singapore expansion." Arthur's face twitched. "Those are confidential." "Not to the owner," Victoria said. She tossed the folder onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Arthur. "It seems, Arthur, that you have been funneling company funds into a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Project Phoenix. I believe you called it diverting capital to build your own golden parachute." The room gasped. The board members who had their hands raised slowly lowered them. "That's a lie," Arthur shouted, standing up. "That's slander." "It's a bank transfer record," Victoria said calmly. "Authenticated by the Swiss authorities this morning. Mr. Blackwood is currently handing the evidence to the district attorney. She placed her hands on the back of his chair and leaned in close to his ear. You wanted to strip me of my power, Arthur. I haven't even started using it yet. She pointed to the door. Get out. You're fired. Arthur looked around the room. He looked at his allies, but they were all looking down at their papers, terrified to make eye contact. He was alone. You'll regret this. Arthur spat. You have no idea what you're doing. You've started a war. I didn't start it, Victoria said, but I'm certainly going to finish it. Kane stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. Arthur shrugged him off, grabbed his phone, and stormed out of the room. Victoria watched him go. Then she turned to the stunned board of directors. She sat down in the leather chair at the head of the table. It was still warm from Arthur, but she made it hers instantly. Now, Victoria said, opening her notebook. Item number 2. I understand we have a lease renewal coming up for Goldman Sachs at 200 West Street. I would like to propose a 300% rent increase. Shall we vote? New York City can be a lonely place when you are on top, but it is a prison when you are at the bottom. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, Richard Halloway sat in a dive bar in Hell's Kitchen. The leather booths were cracked, the floor was sticky, and the air smelled of stale beer and regret. He wasn't wearing his Brioni suit. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down and jeans that were slightly too tight, the result of a diet consisting entirely of fast food and cheap whiskey. Goldman Sachs had fired him 24 hours after Victoria's team sent the transcripts. Gross misconduct, they called it. The eviction notice from his apartment came the next day. Jessica had blocked his number. His friends, the bros he used to close deals with, suddenly had full voicemails. He stared at his phone, scrolling through news articles. The Kensington enigma, how Victoria Halloway went from Brooklyn housewife to American royalty. Goldman Sachs agrees to record-breaking rent, hike to keep HQ. Who is the mystery man on Victoria Halloway's arm spoiler? It's her bodyguard. Richard threw the phone against the table. It's not fair, he slurred. It's my money. She was my wife. That's community property. Technically, inheritances are excluded from community property unless co-mingled. A voice said from the shadows of the booth behind him. But I admire your sense of entitlement. It's useful. Richard squinted into the gloom. A man slid into the booth opposite him. He wore a trench coat and a baseball cap pulled low, but the Patek Philippe on his wrist gave him away. Arthur, Richard whispered. Arthur Sterling. The disgraced former CEO of Sterling Kensington nodded grimly. He looked worse than Richard. His eyes were sunken dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He had been stripped of his stock options, his reputation, and his legacy. She took everything from me, too, Arthur said, his voice a low growl. My company, my birthright. She walked in there with her high and mighty lawyers and treated me like an intern. She ruined my life, Richard spat. I made her. She was nothing without me. Then we have a common enemy, Arthur said, signaling the bartender for 2 fingers of scotch. And I have a plan. What kind of plan? Richard asked, leaning in. She has an army. That bodyguard, Kane. He looked like he wanted to eat my liver. Muscles are useless against information, Arthur said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Victoria has a secret, a gap in her history. Those years she spent in Europe with her grandmother. There are rumors. What rumors? That she was institutionalized. Arthur lied. It was a fabrication, a desperate gambit, but he knew Richard was desperate enough to believe it. She had a breakdown in her 20s. If we can prove she is mentally unstable, we can challenge the competency of her taking over the trust. We can file an emergency injunction to freeze her assets." "But how?" Richard asked. "I don't have access to her records." "No," Arthur said, sliding a USB drive across the sticky table. "But you have her old laptop, the one she left behind in your apartment when you kicked her out of the bedroom. You never wiped it, did you?" Richard's eyes widened. He had kept it in a box in storage, intending to sell it. "I have it," Richard breathed. "Find something," Arthur commanded. "Emails, diary entries, photos, anything that makes her look crazy, depressed, or unfit. The Kensington Gala is in 2 days. It's her official debut to New York society. Every major investor, politician, and rival will be there." Arthur took a sip of the cheap scotch and grimaced. "We aren't just going to sue her, Richard. We are going to destroy her on stage, in front of the entire world. And when the dust settles, I'll take back the company, and I'll give you a $10 million consulting fee." Richard grabbed the USB drive. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. It was a dark, twisted hope, but it was enough. "I'll find it," Richard swore. "I'll bury her." Meanwhile, in the penthouse of the plaza, Victoria was fighting a different kind of battle. "I cannot breathe, Genevieve," Victoria gasped, clutching the side of the vanity. "Beauty is pain, chérie," Genevieve said, tightening the laces of the corset. "This is not just a dress. This is armor. You are attending the Met Gala as the hostess. You must look like a goddess who descended from Olympus to judge the mortals." Victoria looked in the mirror. The gown was a deep, midnight blue velvet that shimmered like the night sky. It was off the shoulder, exposing her collarbones with a slit that went dangerously high up her thigh. It was daring. It was bold. It was everything the old Victoria would have been terrified to wear. "I feel like an imposter," Victoria whispered. "What if they see through me? What if they see the girl who clipped coupons?" Alistair Blackwood, who was sitting in a velvet armchair, reading the Financial Times, looked up over his spectacles. "Victoria," he said gently. "Do you know why your grandmother left you the company? Because I was the only relative left." "No," Blackwood said, standing up. "Because you were the only one who knew how to mend things. Arthur knows how to break companies apart and sell the pieces. Richard knows how to gamble with other people's money. But you spent 6 years fixing broken antiques. You have patience. You see value where others see trash." He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "The business world is broken, Victoria. It is full of greed and ego. Helena believed you were the one to fix it. Do not let them make you feel small. You are the giant now." Victoria took a deep breath. She touched the emerald necklace around her throat, the Kensington crown jewel worth more than the entire block she used to live on. "Is the security ready?" she asked. "Kane has a perimeter around the Met," Blackwood assured her. "But be warned, Arthur has gone dark. We cannot track him. He is planning something." "Let him come," Victoria said, her eyes flashing in the mirror. "I'm done running." The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed. The Temple of Denda was bathed in golden light. 1,000 white roses adorned the tables. The air was filled with the sound of a string quartet and the gentle clinking of champagne flutes. The elite of New York were there. Senators, tech moguls, fashion icons. They all turned as Victoria descended the stone staircase. Silence rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of whispers. She looked regal, unapproachable, beautiful. She moved through the room, shaking hands, making small talk. Sophie, her PR manager, was whispering names and facts into a tiny earpiece Victoria wore. "Senator Davis. Wife is recovering from hip surgery. Ask about his poodle. Tech CEO Mark Salinger. Just lost a massive lawsuit. Do not mention crypto." Victoria navigated the shark tank with grace. She felt powerful. Until she saw them. Standing near the catering entrance, looking out of place in rented tuxedos, were Richard and Arthur. They shouldn't have been there. The guest list was airtight. Victoria tapped her earpiece. "Target acquired, 3 o'clock. "I see them." Kane's voice crackled. "They must have bribed a caterer. I'm moving to intercept." "No," Victoria said, stopping him. "Wait, let's see what they do." She watched as Arthur moved toward the AV booth, where the technical director was managing the massive projection screens behind the stage. Richard was looking at her, a smirk on his face that made her stomach turn. He held up a champagne glass in a mock toast. Arthur slipped something to the technician. A bribe, a threat. The technician nodded nervously and inserted a USB drive into the main console. The music stopped abruptly. The lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. Arthur Sterling walked up to the microphone, tapping it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur announced, his voice booming through the hall, "if I could have your attention, as the former CEO of Sterling Kensington, I feel it is my duty to ensure transparency. You are all here to celebrate the new ownership." "But do you know who you are really celebrating?" The crowd murmured. Security guards started moving in, but Arthur waved a hand. "Please, watch the screen. A little insight into the mind of Victoria Halloway." Arthur pointed dramatically to the massive screen behind him. Richard, standing in the crowd, laughed aloud. "Here it comes. Vic, game over." The screen flickered to life. Victoria held her breath. What did they find on that laptop? Her private journals, her bad poetry, photos of her crying after Richard yelled at her. The video began to play. But it wasn't Victoria on the screen. It was grainy security footage. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. It showed a dimly lit bar in Hell's Kitchen. Richard Halloway was sitting in a booth, drunk, waving a USB drive. "She's crazy, Arthur." Richard's voice on the video was slurred, but loud, amplified by the museum's speakers. "I'll tell everyone she was hearing voices. We can forge the medical records. I know a guy in Jersey who can Photoshop anything." The crowd gasped. Arthur on stage froze. He looked back at the screen in horror. The video cut to another angle. Arthur Sterling leaning in. "Good. We destroy her character. We say she's mentally unfit. Once I get the power of attorney, we liquidate the charity division first. That's where the liquid cash is. We can drain 100 million before anyone notices." Richard's voice again. "And I get my 10 million. Right, I need to pay off my bookie." The video ended with a freeze frame of the two men shaking hands, looking like conspiratorial villains. The silence in the Temple of Dender was deafening. Arthur turned to the AV booth. The technician was gone. Standing in his place was Sophie Victoria's PR manager, waving a small tablet with a cheerful smile. "You really should change your passwords, Arthur." Sophie's voice came over the PA system. "And maybe don't hire a private investigator who is on our payroll to follow you." Victoria stepped forward. The crowd parted for her like water. She walked up the stairs to the stage. Arthur looked like a trapped rat. He looked for an exit, but Kane was standing at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, looking very pleased. Victoria took the microphone from Arthur's trembling hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice steady and cool, "I apologize for the interruption. My cousin and my ex-husband seem to have mistaken this gala for a confession booth." She turned to Arthur. "You wanted to reveal the truth? Here it is. You are a thief who tried to embezzle from a company my grandmother built to help people." She looked down into the crowd at Richard, who was trying to hide behind a waiter. "And you," she said, her eyes locking onto him, "you are a sad, small man who thinks strength comes from bullying. You wanted to prove I was unfit. All you proved is that I was smart enough to divorce you." "Police!" someone shouted. 2 NYPD officers marched onto the stage. They handcuffed Arthur Sterling. "Arthur Sterling," the officer said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and corporate espionage." Another pair of officers grabbed Richard in the crowd. "Get off me!" Richard screamed, thrashing. "I didn't do anything. It was his idea. Victoria. Vic. Help me, I'm your husband." "Ex-husband," Victoria corrected into the microphone. As they dragged Richard away, he looked back at her. He saw the woman he had mocked, the woman he had called a parasite. She stood bathed in golden light, surrounded by billionaires who were applauding her poise. She looked like a queen. "Take him away," Victoria said, dismissing him with a wave. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. It wasn't polite applause. It was genuine respect. She hadn't just survived the scandal. She had weaponized it. Alistair Blackwood met her as she walked off the stage. He handed her a glass of champagne. That, Blackwood said, wiping a tear from his eye, was positively Machiavellian. Helena would have been so proud. "Did we get the recording?" Victoria asked. "Sophie streamed it live to every news outlet in the country." Blackwood grinned. "It's already trending. Hashtag the Queen checkmates." Victoria took a sip of champagne. It tasted like victory. 6 months later, snow dusted the massive windows of the new Kensington Antiques flagship on Fifth Avenue. It wasn't just a store anymore. It was the engine behind the Helena Initiative, a foundation providing legal aid to women trapped in financial abuse. Victoria sat in her office, no longer the shrinking Violet, but a titan of industry. Sophie entered, placing a grim, wrinkled envelope on the mahogany desk. The return address was Rikers Island. "Richard sent it," Sophie said quietly. "He and Arthur were sentenced yesterday. 15 years for Arthur for the embezzlement. 5 for Richard for conspiracy. He's begging you to read it." Victoria held the envelope. She thought of the man who had mocked her dreams, isolated her, and called her a parasite. He had 6 years to speak to her, with kindness. He was out of time. Without a word, she dropped the unopened letter into the shredder. The machine whirred, turning his final attempt at manipulation into confetti. "Mr. Blackwood is downstairs." Sophie smiled, her eyes bright. Victoria descended the grand staircase to find Alistair waiting with Barnaby, her golden retriever, wagging his tail furiously. Beside them stood a tall man in a flannel shirt with sawdust on his hands. "Victoria," Alistair said warmly, "meet Julian. He runs our restoration workshops." Julian didn't bow. He didn't check her expensive watch. He just smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ms. Halloway, I saw your restoration work on that Louis XIV chair. The joinery was honest. It's rare to see that kind of care." Victoria shook his rough, warm hand. For the first time, a man was looking at her skill, not her checkbook. She caught her reflection in the shop window. The frightened housewife was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and forged herself into gold. She wasn't just a billionaire heiress. She was finally unapologetically Victoria. The story of Victoria Halloway isn't just about revenge. It's about realization. It's about the moment you realize that the person telling you you're worthless is actually terrified of your worth. Richard thought he was crushing a flower, but he was actually watering a seed. In the end, Victoria didn't just win the court case. She won her life back. She turned her pain into power, her silence into a roar, and her legacy into a shield for others. And as for Richard, he learned the hard way that when you dig a grave for someone else, you'd better make sure you don't fall in it yourself. Wow, what a journey. if Victoria's transformation gave you chills, or if you just loved seeing justice served. Ice cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only for you to prove them wrong? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.